first portion, we'll talk about what some of those evidence-based practices are. And if you joined me during the last session I did last week, we talked about many practices that are out there. I mentioned that if you put in, treatment for autism, I think 700 million hits come up on Google, for example. And some of those treatments have unfortunately been harmful over the years. There are also other treatments that require additional research. But basically what we do know is that interventions that are based on applied behavior analysis, or ABA, and early intensive behavior treatment have definitely been the most effective interventions for autism. So here again, the next two slides have the list of the 27 identified evidence-based practices. And the ones in red are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. So specifically, antecedent-based interventions, extinction, functional behavior assessment, functional communication training, reinforcement. So those are the ones that I'm going to go over specifically. I hear a little bit of feedback. If whoever is not on mute, if they could put themselves on mute. Thank you so much. So let's do a quiz right away, since so there are medications to cure ASD. You can put this information in the chat. Usually I have you guys hold up cards, but since we don't have that option, go ahead and put it in the chat. And the answer is no, there are no medications currently to cure autism spectrum disorder. Early intervention has been shown to be effective for children with autism. True or false? Yes, this is very true. This is one of the very highly promising interventions that have been shown to be effective for children with autism. Some treatments have been shown to be harmful. This is also true. There have been many treatments over the 60s and 70s that caused death in some cases. You can email me later if you want more information about that and weren't able to join the last time. The next question, ABA works for children with autism? Yes, this is true. ABA definitely does work for children with autism. And like I mentioned last time, many of you already do ABA-based interventions in your classrooms without even realizing it. So it definitely is an effective method for people with autism and many people. And then finally, there are 27 evidence-based interventions for students with autism. This is also true. And today we're going to talk about, I think, 5 or 6 of them. Okay, so let's get into the meat of it. For section 2, we'll talk about using those evidence-based practices when we're dealing with challenging behaviors. So if you joined us last week, or even if you didn't, some of the differences with people with autism is that they have challenges with social interaction skills, communication skills, and then also they might engage in repetitive or perseverative patterns of behavior, or have kind of specific interests or activities that they're almost obsessive about. And often what we see is that because they don't know how to initiate those social interactions, or they don't know how to use appropriate communication skills, these challenges and differences can lead to behavior challenges. So to somebody that may not understand what that person is going through, it might seem like, oh, they're being so challenging or so difficult, but it's actually much more related to these learning differences that they have in social interaction, communication, and then those repetitive or perseverative patterns of behavior. So this next slide kind of has some depictions about, some of the behaviors that we see commonly in our classrooms. So some kids might bite, or they might cry and scream, or they might have challenges sharing, or they may not know how to initiate social interactions, or they may not know how to play with other kids their age. So they might want to play by themselves. Or in like the last picture here, they might have some sensory challenges where, they're sensitive to noise and things like that. And all of these can affect a student's behavior, especially in school, because, guess what? We have to work together and play with other kids. There are a lot of loud noises. There are a lot of opportunities for sharing and peer interactions and communication and different things like that. And if our students have learning differences in those areas, they're certainly going to have behavior challenges. And the most important thing related to that with regard to challenging behavior is that not just challenging behavior, but any behavior, is that it happens for a reason. And children and people in general engage in challenging behavior because it works for them. So the kid who screams and cries at the grocery store because they want a bag of chips, and it works because the mom is like, okay, stop, I'll get you the bag of chips. Guess what? They're gonna, do that same thing next time they want a bag of chips and they're in the grocery store. Or the student who might push their peer because they want to initiate some kind of interaction with that friend, but they don't necessarily know how to say, hey, what are you playing? Or can I play with you? So they might push the friend, or they might, grab something from the friend. And if it continues to work for them, they're going to continue to engage in that behavior. The other thing to remember about behavior is that it's really important when we're looking at challenging behavior to understand the why of the behavior. So we have to try to figure out why that student is, or a person is engaging in that challenging behavior. What need is it meeting for them? These two memes right here, I think they're pretty funny. So I can hear you guys all virtually laughing, by the way. Just kidding. So the first one here, it says, how do you do it? Simple. Whenever he starts crying, just give him his teddy. And those are the parents talking, the two moms talking. And then on the bottom, the baby is saying, dude, how do you do it? Psh, easy, bro. Just start crying. Mom gives me a teddy every time, because it works for him, right? And then on the second meme, it says, so let me get this straight. I don't have to cry and yell to get my cookie. So this piece speaks to those replacement behaviors. So what can we teach this child who's crying for a cookie instead to still get the cookie and that need met, but what's a little bit more appropriate than crying? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And many of you may be familiar with what's called the ABC model, or you might hear myself or other behavior analysts or school psychologists asking you to collect, if you're a teacher or paraprofessional, to collect some ABC data, if they're doing a functional behavior assessment, or having some behavior challenges with the student. So what this refers to is the basic building block that we use to try to figure out the why. It's not quite this simple. This is not, the end all be all of it, but this is a very important tool. And if you collect this antecedent behavior consequence, or ABC data, you can try to see some patterns in the behavior and try to see, the why, and why is this behavior happening? So when you look at the antecedent, you want to think about, where is the behavior happening? Is it only happening in math class, or is it only happening out on the playground? Is it only happening during recess or in the cafeteria when it's really loud, for example? And then, is it certain times of the day? Is it only happening the first half hour? With whom? Are there certain people around? Or under what demand? So anytime someone asks the student to do something, are they engaging in, a unwanted behavior? And then related to what the behavior looks like, we also want to be very specific about what we call it and how we define it also. So do we hone in on just one specific behavior, or do we look at many behaviors that go together? And then the other piece related to the ABC model is that we want to also think about, what are the consequences, or what happens right after the student engages in the behavior. So what do the teachers say or do? What do the friends say or do? Or what do the friends not say or do? That's also really important as well. The other final factors that we want to think about is, what's going on at home? What happened on the bus? Is the student hungry? So those are these other environmental factors down at the bottom here that we want to consider as well. And then when we are collecting our ABC data and gathering a lot of information, observing the student, different things like that, we try to figure out the why. And in general, there are 4 primary, what are called functions or reasons for behavior. And this is not just challenging behavior, this is all behavior. And an easy way to remember this is everybody eats. So the EATS stands for, and I'll go through each one of these. It's escape, attention, tangible, or sensory. So chances are that student that you have, or your own child, or your nephew or niece, or whomever is engaging in challenging behaviors, they are doing it because it's for one of these reasons. So for the escape avoidance function or reason, that just usually means that that child is trying to get out of something that they consider to be aversive or something that they don't like. And then the next function is to get attention, exactly what it sounds like. So basically they want to get either an adult's attention or a friend's attention. And for this, it's important to remember that it doesn't matter if it's good attention or bad attention. It could be, negative by somebody saying like, no, stop, don't do that. It could be that kind of attention, or it could be, a parent getting off the phone, or, looking at the student in that moment after they engaged in some unwanted behavior. Or it could also be to get access to something. So this is the example I mentioned earlier about the child in the in the grocery store who wanted the bag of chips and they were crying. So this is because they want that. They want that item or activity or whatever it might be. And then the final function or reason of behavior is the sensory one in the everybody eats. And this is what's called to get automatic reinforcement. So to get some sort of sensory stimulation. So basically, this is the kid who might spin around a lot or might run back and forth because for whatever reason, it feels good to their body to do that. Or if they're nervous, they might have to do something that's kind of repetitive or perseverative to calm them down, for example. So let's do one together, a little activity. And you can put the responses in the chat for the next slide. For this one, I'm going to give you the answers. So if you want to write it down somewhere, that's fine. So for the first one thing I want to mention first is that if you look in the behavior column, the behavior is basically exactly the same for all of these examples. So it's child screams, child screams, child screams, and child screams. But the antecedent, or what happened right before the child screaming, is going to be different. So I want you to remember that, because we sometimes think, oh, I had this other kid last year who also used to scream in the same way. Or I had this other kid who used to bite all the time. So the function must be, attention, or the function must be escape. And that's challenging for us to go down that road just because we've seen the behavior in the past and we identified one function might not be the same function for another student. So you have to look at it individually based on what the antecedents are and what the consequences are. So let's look at the first one. In this first example, the child sees candy, child screams, mom gives candy to the child. So they got what they wanted, basically. So the function for this one is going to be that tangible, the T. In this next example, mom is on the phone and child screams. Mom gets off the phone and yells, "What?" So they got mom's attention in this situation, right, by screaming. So for this one, the function would be attention. Let's look at the third one here. Dad says, "Put on your shoes," and the child screams, and maybe they, throw the shoes or whatever. And then dad leaves the child alone. Guess what? They just got out of putting their shoes on. So this would be the E, or the escape function. So they got out of doing something that they didn't want to do by engaging in this behavior. And then for the final one, child is unengaged and alone, and the child screams. And the child is still left alone as part of the consequence. So there's nobody asking them to do something. There's nobody giving them attention, anything like that. They are just screaming because they may like the vibration in their throat, or they might like the sound of their own voice when they scream. So for this one, it's going to be the sensory piece. Okay, so let's try one together, and you can put your answers in the chat for this. So for the first one here, the antecedent is going to be puppy is sleeping when Mary walks in the door. Puppy runs up and jumps on Mary's leg. And then what does Mary do? Mary pets the puppy and gives the puppy a treat. What do you all think the function is? And I'll give you a little time to put the answers in the chat. Okay, so for this one, this is a tricky one because Mary pets the puppy, so that could be seen as attention. And the puppy also gets a treat, so that could be tangible. So here's a situation where it could actually be two different functions. And we might have to tease this out a little bit more to see which one is going to be the more overriding function. So maybe I'm going to do a week where I only pet the puppy and see, if the puppy continues to run up and jump on my leg if I only pet the puppy. Or I might do another week where I only give the puppy a treat and I don't pet the puppy. And I see if, what happens to kind of tease it out. But it's also common that sometimes it's not just one function. It might be two functions as well. Speaking of puppies, my puppy is barking right now. I apologize if you can hear that. And then for the second example here, so the antecedent, or what happens right before the behavior, is that the teacher presents the work activity and tells the student to complete it. And what does the student do? And this is a real example, by the way, of a student that I used to have years ago. Student begins biting his own hand. And then what does the teacher do? The teacher removes the work activity and gives the student a chewy. So what do you all think the function is for this? Put your answers in the chat. Give you a couple of minutes, or actually probably like 30 seconds. So for this example, some of you may have said escape, some of you may have said sensory. And in this case, and we can tease that out, but chances are it's probably going to be escape. So let's say if you gave the student the chewy, and then the next time the teacher presented the work and the student had the chewy, had access to the chewy, they had it in their mouth, but they still started biting their own hand, and then the teacher removes the work, then it's definitely going to be that escape piece, okay? And then and then for the final example here, so let's say parents start talking to each other and the child begins yelling loudly and hitting the sibling with a toy. And the consequence is the parents stop talking to each other and begin yelling at the kids. Probably going on in many households all week, right? So what's the function for this one? This one's a pretty straightforward one. So this one is likely going to be attention. So it doesn't matter that the parents are yelling at the kids and it's that negative attention that they're getting from their parents. They basically get attention for, yelling loudly and hitting each other. Okay. All right. So let's look at each of these functions a little bit more closely. So for the escape or avoidance function, it's usually they're trying to communicate something. And what are they trying to communicate? They're trying to communicate that they want to stop an activity or escape it or, avoid it altogether. Usually we see this a lot when the activity is something that that student doesn't like, or it could also be that the activity is difficult, or the activity is new. And those are all situations where you might see the student engaging in a behavior to escape or avoid something. So we want to think about, when we're thinking of interventions, how can we try to help them if something's difficult or new, or if it's something that they don't like. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We also see the escape avoidance function when a student has to engage in something that's out of their regular routine, or if there's a change in the setting. So, fire drill days or field trip days or substitute teacher days, you might see an uptick in behavior, and it might be related to them escaping or avoiding this change that they may not like necessarily. It could also be that they're sick or they're hurt, or some kind of physical discomfort, and they can't communicate that necessarily. So they want to not engage in whatever task that you're asking them to do. Okay, let's look at a quick video here on what the escape avoidance might look like.
All right, Duncan, we're going to work on your letters now.
No.
It looks like you might need a break. Here you go. Here's your pinwheel.
So guess what happened in that example is that this child basically didn't want to do the work. They knocked it off the table, happens all the time, and they got a break as a result of doing that. So next time when this teacher asks the child to do this behavior, they might continue to engage in this type of behavior where they're knocking things off the table or something like that, because they're trying to avoid that activity, right? So we want to think about, when we're allowing breaks, the timing of it, because if we do it every single time you give that kid work, then they might learn very quickly that, oh, this is the way that I get this teacher to not give me any more work. Okay. What happened? Okay, let's see. All right, so then we want to talk about the next function, the A, to get attention. So in this function, it's usually that this child or person is trying to communicate that they're not getting enough attention in terms of, from a specific person or a group of people. And again, doesn't matter whether this attention is positive or negative. It's just attention, right? So sometimes it might happen when their attention is divided. So meaning someone was paying attention to them, but then now they stop paying attention to them. Or it could be that no one is paying attention to them because there's another student in the classroom that's having an even bigger behavior challenge. So all the adults and all the kids, their eyes are on what's going on over there. So then you might see this student now also start engaging in behavior challenges because no one's paying attention to them. It could also be when another student is getting attention, whether it's positive or negative attention, or if it's a situation where there's a preferred peer nearby. So meaning there's a friend that they really, really like, but they don't quite know how to initiate those social interactions with them. And every time that friend comes near them, they might do something that's unwanted or inappropriate to try to get a reaction from them. So let's look at a video. I have two here. I'm going to show you guys the shorter one, but I'll show you the funnier one, but you're more than welcome to go through the second one as well. Okay, so let's look at this one. Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. So what happens in that example, it actually goes on and on for, the whole minute and a half of the video, where basically the child follows around the mother and starts crying the minute that they see the mother. For sake of time, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you, the entire minute and a half, but basically it's, if I see you, I'm going to throw a tantrum. If I don't see you, I'm going to stop. And it's really, really obvious. Actually, I think I do want to show you this one, because this one's pretty quick. But okay, so in this video here, this child, clearly he was playing by himself. There was a group of students playing over here, and he initially went over and he went, and he did the little tongue out and the noise to try to get their attention. No one was really paying attention to him. So then he kind of upped his game a little bit and upped the ante, and hit the kid, or scratched the kid. So basically, you might see that where if one thing doesn't work, then they're gonna do something else. And it didn't matter that the attention that he got from his friends was negative, and the friends saying, "Stop doing that," and then he tried to repeat it, right? So, which also tells me that this child might have some communication challenges, and certainly some social challenges. So they may not necessarily know how to say, "Hey guys, what are you playing?" or "I want to play." So it's not that they're trying to be bad or do something to annoy their friends. They just don't know how to do that, and they may have some learning differences in that. And then for the next function, that's to get something. This is the one that we're all most familiar with. So this is, the screaming kid in the store that we see often, because they want to get something. It might be an item, activity. It might be like access to a person, access to mom or dad, or a sibling. Or it could also be to protest when something is taken away. So, iPad has to end because it's bedtime, or we have to leave the park, and they don't want to. So instead of saying, "Oh, can I have 5 more minutes?" because they don't know how to ask that necessarily, they might get really upset and cry and scream. Usually when this happens, it's an indicator of what that child or person has done in the past that's worked. So if I cry and scream when it's time to leave the park, and mom and dad automatically say, "Okay, that's all right, we can stay for another 20 minutes at the park," guess what? The crying and screaming worked. So they're going to continue to do that. It also, if you see kids that are using this tangible function to get things that they want, it definitely, gets them whatever item or activity that they want. Okay. And then finally,
Monica?
Yes.
Sorry, it doesn't seem to be presenting your screen anymore for me, so I'm not sure what's happening here. And the window on the right, it shows the presentation, but I don't know, maybe it's just
the rest of you. Okay, maybe I'll stop sharing and start again.
Yeah, maybe it's just me, but I just wanted to make sure.
And the rest of you see my screen or no? Can't see it. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, let me stop sharing and then try it again. Does that work?
Not yet. Oh, now it seems to be, yeah, if you go over to your slide deck, it should work now. Yes.
Working? Yeah. I think it's when I switch over to the videos.
Yeah.
Possible.
Okay, back to it.
Should I, do people want me to go back, or are you okay if I continue? You all have access to the slides, no?
I think continue.
Okay. I will continue.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Okay, so for this automatic function, this is actually quite rare. So if you sort of look at, 100 different behaviors and we lump them into categories of escape, attention, tangible, and then sensory, sensory is probably going to be like 5 out of those 100 behaviors as opposed to the others. Because human beings, we're all social beings, whether we have autism or not, or other behavior challenges. So chances are it's going to fall into those other 3 social categories, which is the escape, the attention, or the tangible one. So it's going to be rare that you're going to see a student where this is going to be their primary function for behavior, but nevertheless, this does come up. So this is, and it's not explained by one of the other 3 functions if it's just automatic reinforcement. So these are behaviors that are not controlled by those social consequences. And they're automatically reinforcing for this student. So for whatever reason, it helps them self-regulate, or it's a coping skill. So it makes them feel good. So one of my sensory automatic reinforcement behaviors that I don't even think about I'm doing is I'll twirl my hair. Or my dad does the thing where he's like shaking his leg, nonstop, for example. So for whatever reason, we all might have some of these, but the difference between us and some of our students that might have those perseverative interests or behavior challenges is that we know when to and not to engage in these behaviors, whereas for some of our students, it might overtake their entire being and their life pretty much, and it might make learning challenging. It might impede their learning. We also see some of these automatic reinforcement type behaviors when there are deficits in play skills. So, or differences or challenges in play skills. So they may not know, or not just play skills, but also leisure skills. So in very young kids, you might see, lining up toys a certain way. I had a student, we still have a student, that one of the things that he used to do was line up crayons or colors according to the colors of the rainbow. So anytime you gave him any materials to color with, he would insist on lining it up in according to the colors of the rainbow, which then, coloring activities might become challenging in school. Okay. I'm looking at the time here. It's already 4:40, so I'm going to skip this video. It's basically a video of this child spinning the spoon over and over again. So you're more than welcome to look at this on your own, but this is an example of stimming behavior or perseverative behavior for students. So it doesn't quite have a purpose necessarily that we might see, but it brings this child some sort of joy or comfort or something like that. This I thought was a funny kind of meme. There's a cat one too that sort of explains each of them. But what you want to remember is that it's eats. Everyone eats are the 4 functions. So escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. Okay, so let's do a quick little check-in about the functions and behavior. So quickly, true or false? Behavior occurs for a reason. Absolutely. So everyone should be saying yes, definitely. There is no reason where, there's a behavior that happens just because. Every single behavior occurs for a reason. It might be sometimes challenging to find that reason, but certainly there is always a reason. To make others mad is a function of behavior. This is false. So it might make you mad. That might be how you feel, or that child's parents or something like that, but that is not a function. You always want to go back to your everybody eats, the escape, attention, tangible, or sensory. Which leads me to the next question. So how many functions of behavior are there? There are 4 functions of behavior. And what are the functions of behavior? Escape, attention, tangible, and sensory, or everybody eats. Okay. So then let's talk about, now that we figure out what that reason is or what that function is, how do we work with those students and how do we teach those replacement skills? So there are a couple of evidence-based practices that we want to consider when we're teaching replacement skills. So for the previous section, much of what I talked about related to functional behavior assessment and that analysis piece, which is an evidence-based strategy. And then when we're thinking about teaching those behaviors, there are usually 3 parts that you want to consider. And these are basically 3 parts that are listed within a behavior intervention plan, but even within your own classrooms or your school settings or after school programs or whatever setting you're working in, you want to always think about these 3 things or these 3 larger areas when you're trying to change a student's behavior. And the first thing that you want to consider is preventative strategies. So how can I prevent that behavior? And then what can I teach? That's the next section. So a teaching plan to teach a replacement skill or replacement behavior. So if the kid is screaming right now to get that bag of chips, how can I teach that kid to ask for that bag of chips instead of screaming for that bag of chips? Or if the kid is pushing friends over to get their attention, how can I teach that kid to tap the friend on the shoulder or to say, you know, can I play or my turn or something along those lines? Then the third thing that you always want to think about is also how are you going to make that behavior stop working for that kid? So this is where you want to change the consequences because again, remember, we all engage in behavior because it works for us and our students engage in behavior because it works for them. And it might not necessarily be in your own setting. It might be at home or it might be at grandma's house, but somewhere along the way that behavior is making sense and it's working for them. So that's why they're going to continue to engage in that behavior. So when we're thinking about preventative strategies, this is the evidence-based strategy that or practice that we want to think about. It's called antecedent-based interventions or ABI. These are things that you do before that behavior happens. And there are several things that you want to consider when you're thinking about those preventative strategies. The preventative strategies should align as much as possible with the function of the behavior. So I mentioned earlier that some students who might want to escape or avoid a difficult task, for example, because it's too overwhelming for them. So let's say the assignment is write a paragraph. And for this kid, physically writing is very, very hard. And you know that it takes them a really long time to do that. So they always have, a ton of excuses, or they might ask to go to the bathroom, or they might, knock over the work that you're presenting every time you present this writing activity. So you want to think about how can I make this easier for this child? So maybe one of the accommodations that you're going to do is they can type it instead of write it because it's a challenging. So that's a preventative or antecedent-based intervention that you're going to put in place to try to prevent that behavior from happening in the future. And then another thing to kind of remember is that, make very small changes when you're considering your antecedent-based interventions or preventative strategies. Don't try to change 100 things at once. Start with one small thing, and make sure you also have buy-in from other people that work with that student. So, with their parents or grandma or whomever, because the more consistent we all are, the chances of that behavior changing is going to be a lot better. So these are some examples of some of the antecedent-based interventions, and I guarantee you, you all are doing many of these all the time. So, safety-proofing the classroom. So I used to have a student that used to love to throw staplers. So, we made sure every morning that all of the staplers were put away behind a cabinet so that they couldn't necessarily grab it seems easy enough, but these are some things that we want to think about. Changes to the physical space. So if you have a student that likes to run out of the classroom, let's not seat that student as close to the door. Have them seated as far away from the door as possible. And maybe, you're arranging your bookshelves or your actual physical environment in such a way where it's more challenging to run out of that door. So you have a little bit more time to catch them or to prevent them. You also always want to try to give choices. whether it's the order of activities or what activities they want to do. And then, give them materials or tasks in smaller groups. If there's a worksheet that has 10 problems on it, maybe we're showing the child only one at a time, because they get really overwhelmed when they have multiple things all on one page. And then always giving those clear expectations of what's going to happen, how much they have to do, what they're going to do afterwards, using reinforcement, all of that, setting those deals up in advance. That's a fantastic antecedent-based intervention. Also, those kids that might have trouble with, changes to routine, or, going from one classroom to the other, or going from a preferred activity to a non-preferred activity, making sure that we're giving them adequate transition warnings, or setting a timer and letting them know, and then, following through with that later on. But, lots of visual supports, giving them schedules. All of these are antecedent-based interventions that, you are all using right now in your classrooms. The other thing you also want to think about with antecedent-based interventions, or some other examples, is that, prompting the student in advance for communication, let's say. So that they don't know how to initiate play with friends. So as soon as recess starts, take that child to their favorite friend, and you can give them the model, whether it's on their communication device or visual, or giving them the verbal model of saying, let's play. And then the kid repeats it, and then you want to prompt the other kid to then play with them. Also, if it's something that they don't like doing, non-preferred activities, so you might want to pair that with less preferred activities with less preferred activities. So, first then kind of strategies. Also using, what the child likes. If the kid is really into trains, guess what? One of their lessons that they have to do is about trains. So using their interests to your advantage. Using different modalities. So I mentioned earlier, instead of just having them write, having them type. Or, showing material and activities through video and songs, in addition to just reading it and things like that. And then, of course, sensory activities. So for those kids that fall into that sensory category, so if it's I used to have a kid that used to play with their spit, for example. So we made sure that, we gave that child slime that they could play with. As a replacement for playing with their spit. So something very similar to get that same need met, but it's a little bit more appropriate in a classroom setting, okay? And then also, giving them access to things that they like in advance, or, tasks and activities that they might like also. The other section, so that was the antecedent-based interventions that you always want to think about. Then the second section that we always want to think about in those 1, 2, 3s when we're changing behavior is you want to teach a replacement behavior. And how do we teach a replacement behavior? We use functional communication training and reinforcement. So these two things are very, very important. I guarantee you, many of you are already doing this. And a couple of questions when you want to think about functional communication training. So this is where, you're teaching the kid to use their words, the pictures, their communication device, or whatever it might be, to get their needs met. To say, I need a break. To say, no, I don't want to do that. Or I need 5 more minutes. And then you use reinforcement by reinforcing those functional communication attempts. So if the kid says, I need a break, you're going to reinforce that by saying, okay, great, you can take a break, right? And honoring that request, so that they're going to learn that in the future, I'm going to continue to use that functional communication instead of screaming or knocking my work off the table, or whatever that might look like. When you're considering or choosing a replacement behavior, there are several questions that you want to ask. So does this replacement behavior work just as well as whatever that challenging behavior is? So right now, if the kid is screaming to get a bag of chips, and that has worked for them for the last 5 years, 6 years of their life, now you're asking them to say, Mommy, can I have a bag of chips, please? That's a lot, right? So you might start off with just saying chips, or chips, please, or pointing to a picture of chips. So it has to be really, really easy and really fast, or pushing chips on their communication device. Also, you want to make sure that the family supports this and it's an acceptable alternative. So you don't want it to be so strange. So if it's a high school student that likes, let's say the SpEd example for, you might not want to give them like a preschool age slime for a high school student. So you might want to think about something else like hair gel that they can put in their hair or something that has the same feel, something along those lines, right? So it has to be age appropriate and developmentally appropriate as well. And then is whatever your replacement behavior that you're choosing, is it going to have this student stand out even more? Or is it going to hinder them building a positive reputation for them? And is it something that they can practice when they're calm and relaxed? And then you also want to think about, are there going to be opportunities to teach this replacement behavior when this kid is not engaging in those unwanted behaviors? So practice, practice, practice. You want to try to reinforce the new replacement behavior as much as possible so that they learn that, oh, this gets me exactly what I want also, just as fast, just as well. So I'm going to do this instead of the screaming or the crying or throwing or whatever that might look like. And if you can, make sure that replacement behavior is easier, faster, and ideally more effective in getting what they want. And in the number 3 section, I'll talk about how to stop making the other behavior work for them. And then you might have to teach this in small parts. So the example I gave about the chips, it might be that the student is eventually going to do that whole sentence that I mentioned. But initially, you're going to start with just them saying ch or chips, something like that. And that's okay. And when you first start teaching your replacement behavior, you want to make sure you reinforce it. I say every single time as much as possible during the initial stages. And then later on, you can kind of vary that schedule a little bit. And then you have to make sure that your replacement behavior serves the same function. So for the escape, for example, if the child is trying to tell you that they don't want to do something, their replacement behavior also has to be to saying that same thing. So meaning, I need 5 more minutes with my preferred activity. I don't want to move on to the writing activity, or I need a break, something like that. Same thing for if they're trying to get attention. Them trying to get attention using their functional communication needs to get that same need met. So them tapping somebody or them calling somebody by name, the other person then has to acknowledge them so that it works just as well, okay? So these next couple of slides are some examples. So for the escape avoidance, if the kid is trying to escape or avoid, you might teach them to request a break or to request help if you notice that they're always doing it with things that are challenging for them, to ask for more time with something, or to request to do it later, or to request to do another activity. These are all appropriate communications related to escape or avoidance. If it's related to attention, it might be tapping somebody on the shoulder, calling somebody by name, using like a phrase like excuse me or hey or look, or using a nonverbal gesture, so like waving or asking somebody to come over by motioning them to come over. All of those are appropriate ways to try to get attention. And to, get something that they want for the next function, for the tangible function. It might be using words, using signs, using pictures, using a communication device. So all of the things that our speech therapists always are asking us to do. Or it could also be them asking for an alternative when something is not available, because eventually we want to work towards that child working on accepting no and also like waiting for something. And then finally, for the automatic reinforcement function, we also want to try to give them that same need. So I have a student that likes to smell things, for example. So, there are some smell boxes for that student to make sure that they get that as a preventative strategy so that they're not trying to smell the markers or smell the putty or smell the Play-Doh when somebody's trying to work with them. You also want to, related to this automatic or the sensory function, you also want to make sure you rule out medical conditions. And then also teach those skills that they may not have. So they may not know how to play with toys, for example. So you want to teach those skills. And then there are times where you might say that, okay, like this behavior really helps you calm down. So teaching that student to do it when it's appropriate. So teaching them time and place to do that, because we all do that, right? It's a self-management thing. So teaching them that. Okay, we're getting towards the end of it. I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 2 minutes, Kat. So hang in there. Then the third thing, so we talked about the antecedent-based interventions, and then we talked about using functional communication training or teaching the replacement behavior. And then the third thing we want to talk about is make sure that we make the behavior stop working. So meaning changing the consequences, because I mentioned earlier, we all do things because it works. So what this refers to is you put the behavior on extinction. So basically you stop making the behavior work. With this, what might happen is that there's something called an extinction burst. So meaning the behavior might get worse before it gets better. So sometimes this is not recommended, especially in the school settings. We might come up with other interventions if it's a behavior that's very, very unsafe. But in situations where the behavior is not super unsafe and we're okay with dealing with that extinction burst and we're prepared for it and we don't reinforce that behavior, meaning we don't make that behavior work when it's in that extinction period, then the behavior will stop working and the kid will stop using that behavior, and instead they will use that new replacement behavior that you're teaching them. So extinction also is not just ignoring the behavior. So ignoring a challenging behavior when you're using extinction only works when the function of the behavior is to get attention. When the function is attention, then you don't want to give them a lot of eye contact. You always want to maintain safety. You don't want to like react a lot. So if it's really clear to you that this kid is doing something to get a big reaction from you, try not to show your anger or frustration. Stay neutral, stay calm, and try to ignore that behavior as much as you can, but only when the function is attention. Okay. And then when the function of the behavior is to try to get items or activities or sensory stimulation or to escape or avoid certain situations, then if you're just ignoring the behavior, it's not going to work. So that's like the example where the teacher gave the kid work and they knocked it off the table, and then the teacher basically ignored that and gave them, a break. Then guess what? That behavior is actually going to get worse in the future. So you're going to actually inadvertently reinforce it. And then if the behavior is ignored for these functions, it's going to continue and it's going to increase in the future. Okay. And then if the function is something other than attention, then you want to go back to that replacement behavior section and work on teaching them a new way to get that behavior need met. These next few slides have definitely some examples of what the behavior is and what the extinction procedure is, and then how to prompt or teach the new behavior, and then how to reinforce it. I'm out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead through these and go to this last slide. Basically, what you always want to think about, instead of asking, why are you doing that to a kid, you want to think about what's the function or what's the reason? And then how can I figure out the function? Use those ABC data sheets to write it down specifically and look for patterns, or work with your behavior analyst or your psychologist or other team members. And then what's the child trying to tell you? Because guess what? They're trying to communicate something. And what's lacking in the child's skill set or the environment? What do I need to add, or what do I need to take away? And then how can I use those antecedent-based interventions to try to prevent the challenging behavior? And what do I need to teach instead so that the student gets that same need met? And then, finally, what you want to remember is what you do every day matters more than what you do every once in a while. So that consistency piece is key, and stick with it. Behavior is not going to change in 1 day, 1 week, 2 weeks, or a month. Sometimes it takes many, many months. There's no magic potion. It's not going to happen overnight, but it is certainly going to change. Okay, and I think that's it. I do have a practice here. You can look through it, and there's some additional quotes, and there's a final video if you get a chance of 10 things parents of kids on the autism spectrum wish you knew. I think it's a powerful video, so if you get a chance, please do look at it, and I will stop sharing right now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Monica. There was one question here about the medical example. Can you speak more to the ruling out medical conditions? Give a specific example.
Yes, absolutely. So related to the medical conditions, so this means sometimes, I mentioned last week the comorbid conditions. So some of our children with autism might have seizure disorder. So I've had kids in the past that have really, really bad headaches, for example. We don't know that necessarily. So they might start headbanging as their behavior, right? But they're not doing it. There's no pattern to it. So they're not doing it when you give them work, or they're not doing it to try to get attention or to try to get something. They're just doing it all of the time. And it's very, very pervasive. So then in those kind of situations, and we can't pinpoint a certain situation or a certain function, then we might ask the parents to try to talk to their physician, and to, you know, they might do some tests and different things to rule it out. So that's just one example of that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, folks, we really, really appreciate your feedback. I put the feedback link in there. The slides also were shared, and they are all in, everything's linked in the invitation. If there are any final questions that you want to put in the chat, otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
And my email is on the last slide there, I believe. It's dealwism@sfusd, dealwism@sfusd.edu. So if you all have questions, I'm more than happy to answer any additional questions. Sorry, that was so rushed.
Thank you again for joining. Oh, and just a reminder for the we were having issues with the sign-in. For some reason, this particular PD wasn't listed in the sign-in, so just don't worry about the sign-in, folks. So
don't sign in?
Yeah, it's not listed in there for some reason, so don't worry about that.
Oh. So how do we do the sign-in then? If we can't sign in here, do we?
Don't worry about a sign-in, yeah.
Just to let the principal know that we went to this, or?
Are you talking about Prop G?
Yeah.
That information was all linked in the invitation as well, and in the chat feature. There's new Prop G requirements now in our distance thing. I will link it in there one more time. But yes, that's.
Oh, okay.
All right.
So this will be every week now?
Here, I've just linked it in there if you want to review.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Yes, and it's also linked in the invitation. Okay, I think, yep, all the Prop G questions can be answered with that link. But I think that's it then for this evening. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you all.
You're welcome. Bye.
Hi, I'm late, but is this meeting recorded?
Oh, hello.
Yes.
I had a union.
Stop recording though now.
I had a hi, how are you? I had a union meeting today. That's at the same time. I apologize, but the two